The transport truck that had carried them from the processing facility in California smelled of exhaust and the particular staleness of enclosed spaces that have held too many people for too long. Garnet Blythe sat near the back, her canvas bag on her lap, and watched the Arizona desert through the gap in the canvas flap, the way she had learned to watch everything in the past year, systematically without appearing to. The gate of Camp Florence appeared through that gap on the afternoon of October 15th, 1944, and Garnet registered three things in the first 4 seconds. The size of the compound was smaller than she had expected, the number of guards was manageable, and the man standing near the kitchen building on the far side of the yard was looking at the truck with an expression she had not seen on a soldier's face in a very long time. He was not looking at the truck the way you look at a delivery. He was looking at it the way you look at something that troubles you. Sergeant Roscoe Colt had been in the kitchen doorway when he heard the truck. He stepped out because the sound of a truck at that hour meant the women were arriving, and he had wanted to be ready, though he could not have said exactly what ready meant in this context. He watched the truck slow to a stop, and he watched the tailgate drop, and he watched 23 women climb down into the Arizona afternoon. He had grown up on a cattle ranch outside San Antonio, and he had learned there young that you could tell most of what you needed to know about a living thing by the way it moved. These women moved with the careful economy of bodies that had learned not to spend what they did not have. Colt recognized it the way you recognize something you have seen before in a different place. His younger cousins arriving from the city during the worst years of the Depression, moving the same way, conserving without knowing they were conserving. He went back inside and started checking the evening supplies. Garnet was the third woman off the truck. She stepped down and her boots touched American soil, and she stood for one moment taking in the compound before she began the assessment. She could not stop herself from making 3 visible guards, 2 exits. She could see the kitchen building close to the eastern wall, an infirmary sign on the low building to the north. The assessment was not escape planning. It was simply the habit of a mind that had spent 2 years in circumstances where knowing your surroundings was the difference between managing and not managing. Beside her, Leona Wick landed with slightly less steadiness than she would have liked, her legs stiff from the journey, and immediately began counting. It was what Leona did. She counted the distance from the truck to the main building, estimated the height of the perimeter wall, noted the position of the guard towers. She had spent her war as a radio operator, trained to find patterns in static, and she brought the same attention to every new environment. Behind them, both Willa Rand stepped off the truck with her back straight and her face arranged in the expression of a woman who intended to arrive with her dignity intact regardless of what the destination looked like. Willa was 35 and had spent the war managing personnel records and supply requisitions with a precision her superiors had relied on and occasionally resented, and she brought the same precision to the business of being a prisoner. Harriet Foss was the last of the 4 to step down, and she stayed close to Garnet, immediately not grabbing, but near the way a person stays near a fixed point when the ground feels uncertain. She was 19 and she looked it, and the compound looked very large. Lieutenant Neva Keene had been standing at the main building's entrance since the truck turned through the gate. She watched the women arrange themselves in the yard with the eye of someone trying to understand something quickly, and what she saw settled her slightly, not defiance, not aggression. Exhaustion in the particular wariness that comes from too many transitions in too short a time. Keene had received her assignment 3 weeks earlier with minimal preparation. She had been handed a memo outlining Geneva Convention obligations, a floor plan of the converted barracks, and a mandate that could be summarized as maintain discipline and ensure humane treatment without much elaboration on how these two things were to be balanced in practice. She had spent the 3 weeks since trying to think through the details that the memo had not covered. Private Dewey Steed stood beside her, a 45-year-old man from Ohio, whose German had been learned at his grandparents' kitchen table and refined by 2 years of military service that had taken him everywhere except Germany. He would translate. Keene had briefed him that morning on the importance of translating tone as accurately as words, and he had nodded in the way of a man who already understood this. The intake process took 2 hours. Each woman was documented, photographed, assigned a number. Garnet became 2,741. Leona became 2,742. They were issued uniforms in pale gray cotton that fit better than what they had arrived in. Private Floyd Briggs processed the paperwork. He was 22 years old and his brother was somewhere in France, and he handled the intake forms with an efficiency that was indistinguishable from hostility unless you were paying close attention, in which case it was not indistinguishable at all. When he reached Garnet in the line and recorded her prisoner number, he pressed the pen against the paper with more force than the task required. A small and precise expression of something he was not permitted to express more directly. Garnet did not react. She held her arms steady and looked at a point slightly above Briggs's left shoulder and waited for him to finish. When he looked up, he found her eyes already on him, and what was in them was not defiance and not submission, but something more unsettling than either simple observation. He looked away first. Willa, 4 places back in the line, watched this and made a note of it. The young man with the pen would require attention. Corporal Lena Vane led the women to their barracks, a long wooden building with rows of cots and thin mattresses that nonetheless represented an improvement over the conditions of the transit facilities. Lena was 28, Irish-American from Massachusetts, and she had been at Camp Florence for 4 months. She walked with the brisk neutrality of a soldier performing a task, but when she opened the barracks door and the women filed past her, she found herself looking at their faces and seeing in them something she recognized from her mother's stories about arriving in Boston, that specific quality of people who have been in motion for so long that stillness feels unfamiliar. She closed the door behind them and stood outside for a moment before returning to her post. Dinner was announced for 1800 hours, and the women waited for it with the managed expectations of people who had learned not to hope for much from meals. In the transit facilities, they had been fed adequately and no more than adequately, which was to say they had been kept alive and kept hungry simultaneously, a balance that the body accepts because it has no choice, and that the mind tracks obsessively because it has nothing else to do. The smell reached them before they reached the mess hall. Garnet was in the middle of the group crossing the compound when it arrived roasting meat potatoes, something with butter, something with herbs. Her steps slowed without her deciding to slow it. Beside her, Leona gripped her arm once briefly and then released it. Behind them, Harriet made a small sound that was not a word in any language. The mess hall doors opened, and they walked into a room that contained a serving line staffed by 2 people who were behaving as though this were ordinary. Behind the counter, Private Beulah Selby was a robust woman in her mid-30s, with flowers still visible on her apron, and a quality of cheerfulness that seemed in this context almost aggressive. She smiled at the first woman to reach her tray and began serving with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times and enjoyed it each time. Beside her, Colt presided over the main course. Garnet found herself at the front of the line without quite knowing how she had arrived there. She held out her tray. Colt looked at her once briefly with an expression she could not categorize and began to serve. A thick slice of pot roast. The meat separated slightly under the serving spoon, which meant it had been cooking for hours. Mashed potatoes smooth with butter, she could see melting at the edges. Carrots glazed with something sweet. Green beans, a ladle of brown gravy over everything. A thick slice of white bread with a separate pat of butter. Garnet looked at the tray. Beulah Selby said something in English. Steed, standing near the end of the line, translated Sunday pot roast. It is tradition here. Garnet looked up at Colt. He did not explain further. He simply indicated with a slight movement of his head that she should proceed to the tables. She carried the tray to a bench and sat down and looked at what was in front of her. More food on one plate than her unit had divided among themselves in a week during the last months in North Africa. More meat than her family's weekly ration allocation in Berlin before she had shipped out. She picked up her fork. When she brought the first bite of pot roast to her mouth, her hand was shaking. Not with cold, not with emotion, not exactly. The mechanism was more basic than that, her body, having been trained by months of deprivation to operate at a certain level of input, encountered something it no longer knew how to process and express this in the only way available to it. Garnet set the fork down and pressed both hands flat against the table until they steadied, and then she picked it up again and ate slowly and carefully, the way you handle something that might not last. Around her, the other women were doing the same eating with a care that looked like restraint, but was actually disbelief given physical form. Harriet, 3 seats down, had tears running down her face without any change in expression. She was eating anyway. Colt watched from the far end of the serving counter for a few minutes, and then returned to the kitchen and stood there for a while before he started on the cleanup. That night in the barracks, the lights went out at 2100 and no one slept immediately. Leona's voice came from the darkness. Did that really happen, or are we all having the same dream? It was not quite a question. Several women made small sounds of agreement with the uncertainty it expressed. Willa's voice from the other end of the room had happened. The question is why? A pause. Then Willa again, laying out the possibilities in the tone of someone working through an inventory. Perhaps they are preparing us for something worse. Perhaps it is for photographs, evidence of their humanity they can show the world. Perhaps it is only for tonight. Her voice was level. This was the most frightening option, and she said it the same way she said the others, because Willa Rand had learned that the most useful thing you could do with fear was to name it clearly and then set it to one side. Harriet's voice, very small. My grandmother used to make pot roast on Sundays. Before the war, I thought I would never taste anything like it again. Silence after that, the kind that holds something too large for words. Garnet stared at the ceiling of the barracks and thought about her grandmother's kitchen in the apartment in Berlin, the good china brought out for Sunday gatherings that had ended when the war ate everything. Her grandmother had died in the winter of 1943. Garnet had been in North Africa and had learned of it through a letter that took 3 months to arrive, by which time the loss had already happened in some other time zone of feeling that she had not yet reached. She thought tomorrow will answer the question. Tomorrow they would find out whether last night was real or a single unrepeatable kindness. Morning came with desert sun through the barracks windows. The smell of coffee reached them before they reached the mess hall. Real coffee, not the grain substitute that had become standard in Germany. Then bacon, then toast. They walked into the serving line and it was full. 2 eggs per person, 3 strips of bacon, 2 slices of toast with butter and jam, fried potatoes, coffee or milk at the end of the line. Leona gripped Garnet's arm again tighter this time. Beulah Selby was at her post, her demeanor unchanged from the previous evening, as though feeding enemy prisoners a full breakfast was simply a continuation of her ordinary Tuesday. Keene was already seated at one of the tables eating her own breakfast among the prisoners, rather than in the separate officers' area. Garnet noticed this choice and understood it as a choice. Through Steed, Keene addressed the table nearest her. The Geneva Convention requires that prisoners receive the same rations as our own military personnel. This is a standard breakfast, nothing special. Willa, 2 seats down, set her fork on her tray and looked at Keene directly. Your troops eat like this every day. Keene nodded. She took a bite of toast. Every day. Sometimes better on Sundays and holidays. Steed's translation moved through the mess hall in the particular way that important information moves when people are waiting for it. Person to person with the silence afterward, that means everyone is doing the same calculations simultaneously. If this was ordinary, if this was the baseline of what American military provisioning looked like, then every piece of information they had been given about America's wartime deprivation, about blockades and shortages, and American soldiers going hungry was false. Not exaggerated. False. The calculation had an answer, and the answer was very large. After breakfast, Keene announced work assignments. Garnet, with her medical background, would assist in the camp infirmary. Leona, with her organizational skills, would help with supply inventory. Willa would assist with administrative filing. Harriet and several others were assigned to the kitchen under Colt's supervision. Lieutenant Odessa Ord was 34 years old and had built the Camp Florence Infirmary from a supply list in a converted storage room over the course of 6 months, and she regarded it with the proprietary attention of someone who has made something out of nothing and is not prepared to watch it be unmade. She did not object to Garnet's assignment verbally. She expressed her position through the only means available to her. Within the rules of her rank and role, she re-examined every surface Garnet touched. She rearranged supplies Garnet had organized. She did not assign Garnet to any patient care. Garnet responded by cleaning twice what Ord cleaned once. She worked in silence and observed Ord work and recognized in the speed and certainty of Ord's hands a good nurse, possibly an excellent one. And she filed this information in the same place she filed all information that might eventually be useful. In the kitchen, Colt handed Harriet a bag of potatoes and a peeler and demonstrated the task with the patient gestures of a man who has taught people things before and knows that the most important element of teaching is not the explanation, but the waiting. Harriet began peeling. Her hands knew this work. She had grown up on a farm in Bavaria where potatoes were a constant, and her hands remembered the motion before her mind finished deciding how she felt about performing it here. After a while, Colt reached into his shirt pocket and placed some photographs on the counter beside Harriet. His parents. 3 younger sisters who looked in the flat light of the photographs, not much different in age from Harriet. He did not explain them. He placed them there and went back to his own work. Harriet looked at the photographs and then looked at Colt and understood what he had placed there without words. 3 weeks into their captivity, Keene announced that the prisoners were permitted to write letters home. All correspondence would be reviewed for security purposes before being sent, but they could write. The announcement produced a reaction more complicated than relief. Writing home meant confronting in the form of an addressed envelope and a blank page the impossibility of their situation. They were better fed as prisoners than their families were, as free citizens, and there was no way to write this down that would be believed and no way to not write it that would be honest. Garnet sat with her paper for a long time before writing anything. She kept the language careful and spare. I am safe. I am being held in Arizona. The conditions here are adequate, and we are being treated in accordance with international law. She paused before adding, almost despite herself, I no longer know what to believe about anything. Leona wrote, with the brevity of a radio transmission, we receive regular meals. The Americans provide sufficient food. She looked at what she had written and knew it was inadequate and could not think of what adequate would look like. Willa wrote a factual account of the daily routine, the temperature, the work assignments, and at the end, unable to leave the most significant fact unrecorded, the food provisions here exceed what we received in our own military service. The Americans appear to have no shortage of supplies. She considered this sentence and left it. Briggs reviewed the outgoing mail as he reviewed most things in the camp with the thoroughness of a man who believed that attention was the only real defense. When he reached Willa's letter and read the final sentence, he read it twice. Then he found a red pen and drew a careful line under it and wrote in the margin, possible intelligence assessment or coordinated messaging. Recommend review. He passed the mail to Captain Theron Bray with his notes attached. Bray forwarded it to the appropriate channel. 1 week later, Camp Florence received a communication from Washington. A Major Alton Hurd would be visiting the facility to review operations. His arrival was expected within 10 days. Keene read the notification at her desk in the late afternoon and sat with it for a moment before setting it down. Colt was passing the window outside. She did not call to him, but she thought about the conversation she would need to have with Bray, and she thought about the 8 months of carefully constructed normalcy that had produced the letter that had produced this notification. And she thought about Willa Rand sitting on a cot with a piece of paper and a pencil and writing down the most honest sentence available to her. She thought we were always going to get here. Better to know what we are dealing with. Outside, the October light had gone, the particular gold that precedes desert dusk, and the compound looked in that light almost peaceful. He came into the compound without announcement, carrying a leather briefcase, and the settled certainty of a man who had formed his conclusions before setting foot inside the gate. Garnet watched him from the infirmary window. She had learned in the weeks since her arrival to read Americans the way she had once read the faces of officers back home. Not what they said, what their hands did when they thought no one was watching. Major Alton Hurd's hand stayed very still as he crossed the compound. That was the kind of stillness that came not from calm, but from practiced control, and Garnet had seen enough of that particular stillness in her own country to know what it usually preceded. Keene met him at the entrance to the main building. Their conversation lasted 11 minutes. Garnet counted. Colt came into the infirmary 20 minutes later, not because he needed anything, but because he was the kind of man who needed to be doing something when he was worried. He picked up a bottle of gauze from the supply shelf, looked at it, and put it back. Washington sent someone, he said. Ord, standing at the far end of the room with her back to both of them, did not turn around. I know, she said. I can tell by the way Keene is walking. Garnet said nothing. She had learned that silence in this country was sometimes the most useful tool she had. Hurd spent his first afternoon moving through the compound with a notepad and a careful eye, and by evening he had arranged a meeting with Keene that everyone in the camp somehow knew about before it officially happened. The mess hall emptied earlier than usual. Colt stayed in the kitchen longer than he needed to. The conversation between Keene and Hurd was not shouted. That was almost worse. Garnet, sitting in the barrack with Leona and Willa, could hear nothing through the walls of the administrative building, but she did not need to. Willa had already assembled the outline of it from 3 separate overheard fragments, and the expression on Steed's face when he passed the window. He says we are a security risk, Willa said. Her voice carried no emotion. She had learned in the years of the war to deliver bad news the way a surgeon delivers a diagnosis clearly without decoration, because decoration only delays the part where you decide what to do about it. Leona looked up from the inventory ledger she had been reviewing. Because of the letter. Because of my letter, Willa said. She did not apologize, but she set down her pencil. Garnet thought about the letter. She thought about Willa sitting on her cot with a single sheet of paper writing the most careful sentence of her life and still somehow having it turned into evidence. There was a particular cruelty to that, the kind that required no malice, only a system that assumed the worst interpretation was the correct one. What will he do? Leona asked. He will do what men like him always do, Willa said. He will write a report that protects his position and calls it protecting the country. She picked up her pencil again. The conversation was over because Willa had decided it was over, and in the absence of any other authority that was usually sufficient. 3 days later, Harriet Foss slipped on a wet patch of kitchen floor during the afternoon prep work and went down hard, her right ankle bending at an angle that made Beulah Selby pull in a sharp breath from across the room. The sound Harriet made was not a scream. It was the short, surprised noise of someone whose body has just done something the mind had not approved. Colt was beside her before the sound finished. He did not call for Steed. He did not go through the authorization process that Hurd had outlined in the procedural memo distributed 2 days prior. He looked at Harriet's face, looked at her ankle, and walked to the cold storage with the particular efficiency of a man whose ranch upbringing had taught him that the correct response to an injury was to treat the injury and the paperwork could follow at its own pace. He came back with a bucket of ice. Garnet arrived from the infirmary 4 minutes later, medical bag over her shoulder, and found Colt already positioned beside Harriet on the floor, the bucket between them. He looked up at Garnet. She looked at him. Something passed between them that required no translation and no common language, only the shared understanding of two people who have both spent time in places where the difference between doing something and doing nothing was sometimes measured in outcomes you could not take back. She knelt beside Harriet and went to work. Hurd appeared in the kitchen doorway while Garnet was wrapping the ankle with an elastic bandage, Colt's hands holding the ice pack steady against the swelling. Hurd stood there for the length of time it takes a person to observe something completely and make a decision about it. Then he left. That evening, Colt received a written request for formal explanation. Why had he accessed controlled supplies without prior authorization from a commissioned officer? The language of the memo was precise and bureaucratic and entirely accurate about what had happened, in the same way that a map is accurate about the shape of a road without telling you anything about why the road was built. Colt read the memo, set it on the table, picked up his coffee. The next morning, Ord walked into the room where Hurd had set up his review process carrying a folder that no one had asked her to compile. She placed it on the table in front of him without preamble. It was 2 months of medical records from the infirmary, infection rates, treatment outcomes, recovery times. The numbers told a story that was impossible to argue with on procedural grounds because the numbers did not care about procedure. They only cared about what had happened. Ord left the room without explaining the folder because the folder explained itself. Hurd looked at the numbers for a long time. He did not close Colt's disciplinary file, but he did not sign it either. Garnet heard about this from Lena Vane, who heard it from Steed, who had seen the unsigned file on Hurd's desk when delivering the afternoon dispatch. She thought about Ord standing at the end of the infirmary with her back turned, placing gauze exactly where it had been. She thought about the small, precise ways a person can change direction without ever announcing that they have done so. She did not say anything to Ord, but the next morning when Ord handed her a chart without being asked, Garnet accepted it the same way in silence, and they both understood. The weeks before Thanksgiving moved the way desert weeks do in November, with a quality of light that is neither warm nor cold, but something in between that feels like the world holding its breath. The women had stopped flinching when they walked into the mess hall. They had stopped waiting for the abundance to be revoked. This was not trust exactly. It was the way the body learns to accept what the mind still questions. Keene announced the Thanksgiving celebration with the calm efficiency she brought to everything, as though a holiday dinner involving enemy prisoners of war was simply another logistical matter to organize. Bray had approved it. Hurd had not been asked for his approval. Colt's reaction to the announcement was immediate and total. He requisitioned supplies with a thoroughness that made Beulah Selby look at him sideways. The order included a turkey of a size that caused some administrative confusion because the form was designed for quantities measured in pounds, not in approximations of a small child. Harriet, her ankle recovered, found herself at the center of the preparation learning dishes she had no framework for. Sweet potato casserole, cornbread stuffing, cranberry sauce in 2 forms, jellied and whole berry, a distinction that seemed to matter enormously to Beulah, and that Harriet filed away carefully as one of the many things about this country that operated on principles she had not yet decoded. The turkey was a separate matter entirely. When it arrived, Harriet stared at it for a moment with an expression that Colt correctly identified as genuine uncertainty about whether the bird was something unusual or simply large. He demonstrated the preparation without comment, and she watched with the focused attention she had developed in this kitchen, the attention of someone who understood that each thing learned here was a small anchor in ground that was otherwise still shifting. On the morning of Thanksgiving, the mess hall looked like a different room. White tablecloths that someone had found somewhere. Gourds and dried corn arranged along the center of the tables in the configuration that meant celebration in this culture, which Harriet had now learned to read the way she had once learned to read weather. The tables were arranged in a large square so that everyone could see everyone else. The American staff was already seated when the prisoners arrived. Not in formation, not at separate tables, simply waiting the way people wait for family. Bray stood and spoke. Steed translated. Garnet listened to both versions simultaneously, the English and the German, and found that some things translated perfectly and others arrived slightly changed the way light changes when it passes through glass. Bray said they were setting aside their roles, that they were grateful, that gratitude did not require the absence of conflict, only the recognition of what persisted alongside it. The translation rippled through the room and was met with the particular silence of people who are being offered something they are not sure how to receive. Colt carved the turkey with the focused ceremony of a man who had learned from his father that the way you perform a task tells people what you think of the occasion. Willa accepted her plate and looked at it, and then looked away, and then looked back. Harriet moved between the kitchen and the tables with the ease of someone who had found in this strange room in this strange country something that felt like purpose. Hurd sat in the corner with his notepad, He watched Colt move around the tables, checking that every person had enough. He watched Beulah Selby point at each dish and say its name, and the German women repeat it back, their accents heavy and their attempts genuine, and somehow both at once. He watched Leona, who had spent her war listening for patterns and static, lean across the table and explain something to a young corporal from Iowa, her hands moving in the particular way of someone describing home. He stood approximately 40 minutes into the meal, walked to Keen's seat, and bent to speak quietly near her ear. Keen did not look up from her plate. I'm going to note in my report, Hurd said that this facility has developed emotional relationships with prisoners of war that are inconsistent with standard protocol. Keen set down her fork. She looked at him. Write it down, she said. I'll sign my name to it. Hurd straightened. He looked at the room one more time at Harriet, laughing at something Colt had communicated entirely through gestures at Garnet, sitting between Lena Vane and Willa, with a plate in front of her, and something on her face that was not happiness, exactly, but was something in the neighborhood of it. He left the room before the pumpkin pie was served, which meant he left before the part of the evening where the German women learned the English word for pumpkin and the word for pie separately, and then discovered that two acceptable words combined into something that sounded like it should mean something else entirely. And this discovery produced genuine laughter for the first time since October. Nobody called after him. The nights after Thanksgiving carried a different weight. Garnet had expected relief. Instead, she found the women in the barracks quieter than they had been in weeks, and the quality of the quiet was not the quiet of exhaustion, but of something more complicated. Leona put words to it 3 evenings later. It is sitting on her cot with her hands in her lap. How do we accept their kindness, she said, when our people are starving? It was not a question. It was a statement that everyone in the room recognized because they had all been carrying it since the first plate of pot roast, and naming it did not make it lighter. It made it visible, which was both better and worse. Willa offered the practical answer. It was the right answer, and the insufficient one, refusing food, would not help anyone. They needed their strength. When the war ended, Germany would need people who were capable of rebuilding, and they could not do that if they had spent the intervening months diminishing themselves out of principle. The practical answer did not reach the place where the question lived. The tension arrived at its breaking point one evening when Delphine Tully, who had been mostly silent since the first day, pushed her plate to the center of the table and put her face in her hands. She was not a woman given to public emotion. That made it worse. Her children, her husband, they had nothing. She had said this before quietly to herself. Now she said it to the room, and the room had no answer for it because there was no answer that was both honest and bearable. Garnet crossed the table and sat beside her. She put her hand on Delphine's shoulder and waited for the worst of it to pass. Then she said in German, in the same tone she used in the infirmary when a patient needed to hear something true rather than something comforting. Your suffering will not feed your children. When the war ends, they will need you capable. That is the only thing you can give them from here. She was speaking to herself as much as to Delphine. She had understood this for weeks. Understanding it did not resolve the guilt. It only gave the guilt somewhere to stand while the days continued. Colt, standing near the door, heard the tone of it without understanding the words. He told Keen later that evening, they feel guilty about being fed. A pause. I'd feel the same way. Keen said nothing. Outside, the desert was coming into the particular stretch of early spring when wildflowers appeared along the perimeter fence. Small, improbable things that had no business surviving in that soil and managed it anyway. The news arrived on a Thursday in late March through channels that had been carrying worse and worse things for weeks. Keen gathered the women in the mess hall after dinner, and Steed translated with the careful steadiness of a man who had learned that the most important thing about delivering terrible information is to deliver it accurately and then be quiet. Dachau, Buchenwald. The words existed in German too and did not become easier to hear in translation. Willa went white. She sat down not because she chose to, but because her body made the decision before she did. She whispered, "We didn't know." The words came out automatically, the standard defense, and she heard herself saying them and felt in the same moment the specific shame of recognizing that a person can choose not to know something if knowing it would require them to act, and that this choosing has a name and that the name applies to her. Leona looked at her hands and said nothing. She would say nothing for 3 days. Harriet wept without attempting to stop. Garnet stood up and walked outside. It was not a decision. It was what her body did. Lena Vane followed because that was her responsibility, and also because she understood that some moments require a witness who knows when to be present and when to stay out of the way. Garnet stopped in the middle of the compound in the open ground between the barracks and the mess hall and stood still. The Arizona sky at night was a thing that still surprised her, how large it was, how many stars it held, how entirely indifferent it was to everything happening beneath it. She had been looking at it for 6 months, and it had not yet become ordinary. She said in English because English was the language of this place and this moment belonged to this place. I believed I was serving something good. It was not a question. It was not an apology. It was an accounting. Lena Vane stood 8 feet away and did not say anything because there was nothing to say, and because she was Irish enough to understand that some silences are not absences but presences of a different kind. Garnet stood there until she had finished with whatever the night required of her. Then she walked back inside. Sometime later, lying in the dark, she understood for the first time and completely why Sergeant Roscoe Colt had filled her plate that first Sunday evening without hesitation or calculation or need for justification. He had done it because he knew what cruelty looked like and had decided in whatever private way a person makes such decisions to be its opposite. Not as a strategy, not as policy, as a daily practice, something you do because the alternative is a version of yourself you cannot respect. She had been given food by people who knew something she had not yet learned when she arrived. Now she knew it. In the administrative building, Major Alton Hurd received a telegram from Washington. He read it once, folded it in half, and placed it in his briefcase without responding. Through the window of his temporary office, he could see the mess hall, and through the mess hall window, he could see Colt teaching Harriet to adjust the seasoning on a pot of gravy, her face concentrated and intent, his hands moving in the slow, patient gestures of a man who has all the time in the world for this particular lesson. Hurd looked at the telegram in his briefcase. The war in Europe had perhaps 3 months left. When it ended, every decision made in this compound about the treatment of these women would become part of a record. He would need to decide before that happened what he believed the record should say. He left the telegram folded. The radio in the mess hall announced the end of the war in Europe on a Tuesday morning in May, and the sound that followed was something Garnet had never heard before and would spend the rest of her life trying to describe accurately to people who had not been in that room. It was not a single sound. It was many sounds arriving at once and occupying the same space, relief and grief and disbelief and something that had no name in either language she now possessed. The American staff erupted in the way that people erupt when they have been holding something back for a very long time, and the reason to hold it back has suddenly ceased to exist. There was shouting. There was laughter that sounded for a moment like its opposite. The 23 German women sat at their tables and did not make any sound at all. Garnet watched Bray embrace a young corporal she had seen every day for 7 months without learning his name. She watched Lena Vane press both hands over her mouth and close her eyes. She watched Colt, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel over his shoulder, look at the ceiling for a long moment before he looked back down. He found Harriet across the room. She was sitting very still, her hands flat on the table. He did not gesture or nod or perform any of the small communications they had developed over months of shared kitchen work. He simply held her gaze until she looked away first, and somehow this was enough, and they both understood what had passed between them without being able to say what it was. Willa drank her coffee. She looked out the window at the compound, at the place she had walked every day since October, at the gate she had entered through in the back of a truck. Her face showed nothing because Willa Rand had spent 35 years perfecting the expression of a woman who decides when she is ready to feel something and does not allow circumstances to make that decision for her. But her coffee was cold before she finished it, and she had not noticed. Leona had already done the calculation. Garnet could see it. The radio operator's mind was always running the numbers, always arriving somewhere before everyone else did, and the place Leona had arrived was a question that had no comfortable answer. The war ending did not mean Germany existed anymore in the way the word Germany had previously meant. It meant something had ended. What came next was a word that had not been written yet. Garnet thought about her sister. She had been thinking about her sister since March, since the letter that had arrived through Red Cross channels in handwriting that was shakier than she remembered the handwriting of a woman who had been surviving on something less than sufficient for a long time. The letter said, "There is nothing here for you but hunger and rubble. If you have a chance at a better life, take it. I will survive. I am stronger than you think." Garnet had read it 3 times and then folded it and placed it in the canvas bag with the photograph and the comb and had not taken it out again because she did not need to read it again. She had already memorized it in the way you memorize something that will require a decision. 3 days after the announcement, Keene called everyone together. The room held both groups the way it had held them 4 months on the same chairs at the same tables. But the air in it was different now. The invisible structure that had organized the space, the unspoken arithmetic of who was permitted to do what and where and when had not disappeared, but it had loosened the way a knot loosens before it comes undone. Keene stood at the front of the room and spoke in the careful, measured cadence she used for important information, pausing after each section to allow Steed to translate. The process of repatriation, the timeline, The logistics of moving large numbers of people across an ocean in the aftermath of a war that had destroyed significant portions of the infrastructure required to do so. 16 women would return to Germany. The paperwork was already in motion. She paused. There was, she said, another possibility. The United States government was prepared, given the conduct of the prisoners during their time at Camp Florence, given the skills many of them had demonstrated, to allow a small number to apply for permission to remain in America as immigrants. This was unusual. It was perhaps without precedent. It was being offered because the circumstances that had produced this particular group of women in this particular place were themselves without precedent, and sometimes unusual circumstances produce options that the usual rules had not anticipated. Steed finished the translation. The room was very quiet. Then Major Alton Hurd walked in. He had been at the camp for 6 months technically, though his movements in the weeks since Thanksgiving had become less predictable, less scheduled, as though he himself was uncertain about the geometry of his position. He walked to the front of the room and stood beside Keene in a way that was not beside her at all, but rather adjacent in the manner of someone who intends to correct something. He said that the proposal Keene had described had not received final authorization from his office. He said that the women in this room had served the Nazi regime and that whatever conduct they had demonstrated during their captivity did not constitute grounds for residency in the United States. He said this with the precision of a man reading from a document that existed only in his own certainty about how things should be arranged. Keene looked at him. She did not step back. She said, Major Hurd, in the 8 months these women have been in this facility, they have worked, they have contributed, and they have provided medical care to American personnel, including soldiers under your own command. If you have evidence, concrete and specific evidence, that any one of them represents a security risk to this country, I am asking you to present it in this room right now. The room waited. Hurd said nothing. Keene said, I thought so. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Hurd left. He walked out of the mess hall with the same controlled efficiency he had arrived with, and the room watched him go, and no one said anything until the door had closed completely. That evening, Garnet sat with Leona in the space between two barracks, where the moment without speaking, because the thing that needed to be said was not something either of them had words for in any common language, and both of them knew this. Colt said through Steed, so you do not go hungry on the road. Willa's face did what it almost never did. It simply showed what was happening. She said in the English she had been learning for 8 months, thank you, for all the Sundays. Colt looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and stepped back because he was the kind of man who understood that gratitude, when it is real, does not require extension. Willa embraced Garnet. She held on longer than she normally held on to anything. And she said into Garnet's ear, live well, make this choice mean something. She said this in German so that it would arrive in the place where Garnet stored the things that mattered. Garnet could not speak. She nodded against Willa's shoulder. Willa embraced Harriet, who was crying openly and making no effort to stop, and then Leona, who was not crying, but whose face carried something that would take years to fully name. Then Willa straightened her back and picked up her bag and walked to the truck. The other 15 women who were returning followed. The goodbyes took a long time and were not neat or orderly because they were real. It was Private Floyd Briggs who was managing the loading at the gate. He had been there since before the women arrived, standing at his post with the specific efficiency he brought to his duties, the efficiency of a young man who had organized his feelings about this place into a compartment he did not open often. Willa reached the truck and lifted her bag to step up onto the running board. The bag was heavy and her footing on the metal was uncertain. Briggs stepped forward. He took the bag from her hand and lifted it into the truck in a single motion, then offered his hand for the step up. Willa looked at the hand. She took it. She stepped up. Briggs released her hand and stepped back to his position without a word or a change of expression, in the manner of a man performing a task that required no commentary. Lena Vane, standing near the gate, saw it. She looked at Keene. Keene had seen it too. Neither of them said anything because there was nothing to add to it. After 8 months and one long war and 100 small moments that had accumulated into something none of them had names for, a 22-year-old man from somewhere in America had helped a German prisoner into a truck because she needed help, and he was standing there, and some things are simpler than the structures we build around them. The truck started, the gates opened. Garnet stood and watched until the trucks had passed through the gate and continued down the road and become small against the desert, and then become nothing at all against the desert. She stood there a moment longer, looking at the open gate and the road beyond it and the sky above the road, and then she turned back toward the compound. Keene was standing a few feet away. Keene said, "Are you all right?" Garnet considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. Then she said, "I do not know yet, but I am going to find out." Keene nodded. That seemed to be the right answer. 20 years passed. Autumn 1965. The kitchen of a small house in Tucson, Arizona was filled on a Sunday afternoon with the smell of pot roast, the particular combination of browning meat and root vegetables in something herbed and slow that had been developing for 3 hours on a low flame. Garnet Blythe Henderson moved through the kitchen with the ease of a woman who has made the same meal many times and still means it every time. Her husband David set the table in the next room. Their 2 teenage children were conducting a negotiation about who was responsible for the gravy that had been ongoing for approximately 15 minutes and would likely continue until one of them simply made the gravy. The doorbell rang. Harriet Colt stood on the porch in an apron she had forgotten to remove, which meant she had come directly from her catering kitchen in Phoenix, which meant she had been working all morning and had come anyway. She had married Roscoe Colt in 1947 in a ceremony that both of them found somewhat overwhelming, and neither of them would have missed. The catering business was hers, built from nothing with the skills of a Bavarian farm girl and an American kitchen, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has survived enough to know that she can survive what comes next as well. Behind her stood Leona Kimball, who had arrived from Washington the previous evening and who carried herself with the composed authority of a woman who spent her professional life translating between worlds that did not naturally understand each other and had discovered that this was a skill with applications far beyond its original purpose. The 3 women embraced in the doorway the way people embrace when they have not seen each other in 3 months. And when 3 months is simultaneously too long, and given everything a remarkable thing to have available to be too long. The table held what it always held on Sundays, pot roast that fell apart at the lightest pressure. Potatoes done the way Colt had taught Harriet, and Harriet had taught Garnet, which was to say with more butter than strictly necessary, in a patience that did not allow for rushing. Bread that Garnet had made herself that morning because her daughter had asked her to, and this was a reason she found entirely sufficient. After dinner, after the children had disappeared into the comfortable chaos of their own lives, the 3 women sat with their coffee and talked. They talked about Willa, who wrote regularly from Hamburg, in the same organized handwriting she had always had, who was helping rebuild what needed rebuilding, and had found a man with 3 children, and had apparently reorganized his entire household within 6 weeks of meeting him. They talked about Delphine Tully, who ran a bakery in Stuttgart, and sent photographs, every Christmas photographs, of a woman who looked nothing like the person who had pushed a plate away in the mess hall, and everything like who that person had been trying to become. Leona said that she had received a letter from Steed, who had retired from the army and was teaching German at a high school in New Mexico, and who apparently brought up Camp Florence at last of the day's warmth collected before the desert let it go. They had developed the habit of this in the months since November, not because they had decided to, but because some habits form themselves from repetition and proximity in the particular way 2 people occupy the same difficulty. Leona said, if I stay, I am choosing this country over my own. If I go back, I am choosing a country that no longer exists over a life that is possible here. Garnet said, you are not choosing a country either way. Leona looked at her. Garnet said, you are choosing what you are going to do with what happened. That is different. Leona was quiet for a long time. Then she said, what are you choosing? Garnet did not answer immediately. She thought about the letter in the canvas bag. She thought about her sister's handwriting. She thought about what it meant to honor someone by living in a way they had sacrificed for you to live. I am staying, she said. It was the first time she had said it out loud. It did not feel like liberation. It felt like weight, the specific weight of a thing that is true and costs something and is right anyway. The next morning, Garnet passed Bray in the corridor outside the administrative office. He was carrying a folder and moving with the purpose of a man who had made a decision and was now implementing it. She did not stop him, but she understood from the way he moved and from what Steed told her later that day that Bray had called her directly and that the call had lasted 4 minutes and ended with Bray saying that he had read every report generated by this facility for 8 months and that he would be signing the authorization and that Hurd was welcome to note his objection in whatever document he chose to file it in. Hurd filed his objection. Bray signed the authorization. Garnet heard this and thought about Willa saying that men like Hurd write reports that protect their position and call it protecting the country. She thought about the fact that sometimes, not always, but sometimes there is someone above the man writing the report who is looking at different evidence and arriving at a different place. The 2 weeks that followed moved slowly and quickly, at the same time the way time moves when you are waiting for something that cannot be hurried. Willa made her decision in the first hour and spent the remaining 2 weeks preparing for it. She was going back. She said this to the group without drama or apology, the way she said everything as a fact that she had arrived at through a process that was hers alone and did not require endorsement. She needed to see what remained. She needed to face what they had become, all of them, the whole country, what they had permitted by not looking, and she could not do that from Arizona. Running to America, she said, felt like escaping the question at the precise moment the question most needed to be answered. No one argued with her. They understood. Harriet had already told Colt she was staying before Keene's announcement in the kitchen, in the language of gesture and proximity they had built over months, and Colt had nodded in the way of a man who had been hoping for something and was now allowing himself to believe it. Leona took 11 days. On the 12th day, she came to Willa in the late afternoon, and they sat together in the corner of the barrack. The other women gave them a room without being asked. Leona spoke first. I keep asking myself what loyalty means when the thing you are loyal to has become something you cannot defend. Willa considered this for a long moment. Then she said, loyalty and accountability are not the same thing. I am going back because I owe Germany my presence in its worst hour. You are not less principled because you have concluded there is nothing left there for you. Leona said, if I stay, people will say I abandoned my country when it needed rebuilding. Willa said, people will say whatever requires the least thinking. You know what you are choosing and why. That is the only answer that will hold over time. Leona looked at the floor. Then she looked back up. She said, do you think we did the right thing being here, taking their food, learning their names? Willa was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to mean she was answering honestly rather than quickly. Then I think we did the only thing available to us. And I think the way we did it mattered. She paused. That will have to be enough. They did not resolve the disagreement about whether staying was right because some disagreements do not resolve. They only confirmed that they would carry it separately and that this was acceptable, that you could love someone and believe they were making the wrong choice and love them anyway. Leona told Keene the next morning that she was staying. The morning of departure arrived with a particular clarity that the desert reserves for moments that deserve to be seen plainly. No clouds, the light without apology or softness. 7 women would remain. 16 would go. The compound gathered at the gate in the early hours before the heat arrived. Colt had been in the kitchen since 4 a.m. Garnet had heard the sounds of it from the barrack and had lain still in the dark listening, knowing what he was doing and understanding why, without needing to see it. He came across the compound carrying a large basket. He walked to Willa. She looked at the basket and then at Colt, and then she looked inside. Sandwiches wrapped in cloth, apples and oranges, oatmeal cookies still warm enough that she could feel the heat of them through the paper. 2 canteens of water. She stood holding the basket for at least once per semester in ways his students did not always fully appreciate. Harriet said that Colt sent a letter to Keene every year at Thanksgiving. Keene had moved to Oregon after the war and had a garden she was apparently very serious about. Colt said she always wrote back but never said much about herself, only about the garden, which he thought was probably because some people put their feelings into things that grow rather than into words, and that this was a perfectly reasonable approach. Garnet thought about the letter from her sister, the most recent one written in handwriting, that had steadied over the years, the handwriting of a woman who had rebuilt herself the way you rebuild a house room, by room starting with the rooms you need most. Her sister had visited twice and had sat at this table and eaten pot roast and said the second time that she understood now what Garnet had meant all those years ago, when she had tried to explain in letters what it felt like to live in a place where the plates were always full. She had said, I think I understand it now. I am not sure I could have understood it then. Garnet had said, I could not have explained it then either. The 3 women raised their coffee cups. They did this every time. It had become the way the evening ended, not formally arranged, but arrived at the way all the best traditions arrive. They did not say what they were raising their cups to. They did not need to. They were raising them to a Sunday evening in October 1944, when a truck pulled through a gate in the Arizona desert, and a woman with shaking hands stood in a serving line and smelled something that her mind could not immediately make sense of. They were raising them to a Texan with a dish towel over his shoulder who had made a decision so quietly and so completely that it had not looked like a decision at all. They were raising them to Willa, who had gone back and faced the question that needed facing. They were raising them to all of it, the whole strange, impossible thing that had been made from hunger and kindness and 8 months of Sundays in a desert that none of them had chosen, and all of them had been changed by. The coffee was good. The evening was cool in the particular way that October evenings in Tucson are cool with enough warmth left in the day to sit by an open window without needing a sweater. In the next room, Garnet's daughter was laughing at something her brother had said, the unguarded laughter of a young person who has grown up in a house where the doors are open on Sundays and the table is always larger than strictly necessary. The girl did not know why. She had grown up simply knowing that this was how things were done, that Sunday meant gathering and gathering meant food, and food meant something that she could not have articulated precisely, but that she felt in the particular comfort of that room, the way a thing that has been practiced for a long time becomes part of the air. Garnet listened to her daughter laugh and thought, this is what you give them. Not the story, not yet. First, you give them the practice. Later, when they are ready, you give them the reason for it. Outside, the October light was doing what October light does in the desert. Going gold and then going orange, and then letting go of color entirely quietly without insisting on being noticed. The day ended the way good things often end, not with a signal or a ceremony, but with a gradual and complete settling into what comes next.